Welcome back. Now, it's been a few months since I put out my last video, but there's been plenty going on in the background. I've been chipping away on my Starlet, ticking jobs off the list, and as it sits now, it's all back together. It's pretty much done. Still need to build the motor that I've been talking about, but it's idling, driving, and it's all complete, so pretty stoked. It's good to have it all back together. Now, been filming a bunch with the camera over the last few months, and so I've got a few jobs to show you. So had to make a radiator fan shroud. I did have a radiator fan on there initially, but I've made something better, and because I couldn't find the old one. I put some new guard mirrors on it, some better guard mirrors that I found in my part stash. So I went through how I went about mounting those. Did a bunch of paint correction. Cut all the runs out of the paint, wet sanded, polished, buffed, waxed, all that sort of stuff. So there's a good chunk of that. And I did a bit of decal work. Put a banner on the windscreen and some pinstriping and some details. I did miss the pinstriping, as I was a bit afraid to turn the camera on because I had no idea what I was doing. But anyway, got there in the end. Everything's all done. And so, yeah, bunch to show you. I sort of realised all these videos I've been doing had just been here in the shed. So now that the car's together, I took a few good photos and stills and videos of the car sitting out in the driveway. So I've scattered a few good shots throughout the video, so hopefully it's good to watch. So yeah, it's a longer video, so sit down and take a watch. Cheers. So I'm at the point of this build now where I need to start getting a radiator fan sorted. Now I used to have a radiator fan that fit in there, and I actually don't know what happened with it. I must have either thrown it away or it's got lost or whatever, but it was never great. So I'm now going to look at putting a good setup on there. I did wonder about putting a fan in the front of the intercooler there and blowing air through and keep this side clear, but the fan I've got is designed for pulling, so I'm going to put it on the back of the radiator there. Now this radiator has got mounting points on both sides. You can sort of see them there, so that means it's not too bad to make a nice shroud. Now the fans I've gone with, went down to my local wrecker's yard and I bought some, this is actually off a Ford Mondeo, which I'm told are pretty good electric fans from stock. So this used to be a full shroud, twin fans, and I've just cut this fan out, trimmed it up. Now I actually thought I might be able to put this whole shroud on, but it's a bit big for this radiator anyway. So if you have a slightly bigger radiator, these Mondeo fans are actually probably a really good option. So I paid 30 bucks for this. So I've chopped this up, got one of them out. 300mm diameter fan, and this radiator is about 300mm top to bottom. So it works pretty good. I'll just sort of show you. The problem is I run into when this fits in down here, it just starts to come in contact with the front of that pulley there. So I'm actually going to pull that front pulley off and I'm going to machine the front section off it because it's no longer needed. I've got to make sure that where my air filter is going to go, that I don't block that. Now because I'm just going to put the one fan on, I can sort of put it middle or offset it either way. And what I'm decided to do is I'm going to offset it to the passenger side and just try and keep the airflow sort of heading roughly towards where the exhaust is. I'm thinking I might actually cut a hole in my bonnet and put some form of vent up there to try and vent some of this heat out. But if I can put the fan to that side, try and avoid blowing hot air into the intake side where, you know, the air's come out of the compressor, compressed and got hot through the intercooler, nice and cool, and then into the inlet manifold. And if I have this fan blowing hot air at it, it's kind of going to negate the effect. So I'm going to build a shroud, put this fan over that side as much as I can. I may even put a bit of heat shielding and ducting around this and just try and get it to, like I say, go out the bonnet if I put a bit of a vent in it. So I'm going to pull this radiator out, I'm going to pull that front pulley off so I can machine it, and then before I do that I'll take some measurements of where I want this to sit down in there, and then once it's all out I'll make a fan shroud. So like I've done with all the rest of this, trying to use stock parts off other cars which are known to be good, usually always a bit more reliable than cheap aftermarket stuff. So hopefully I'll make a nice shroud here, get this looking good, nice and simple. It's already wired up for the fan. I've got the relays in with all the rest of the relays, and the wiring's tucked in here, so get that on there, and that'll mean I can actually get this thing warmed up and get it to idle and get it to control temp and all that sort of stuff. It currently runs, but without a fan you can't do much with it, so going to get on to this. Hopefully I can make it look good. The rest of the package is pretty tidy, so I don't want to clutter it up too much. Obviously I've got this radiator out now and the fan sitting there. So looking at what I've got to work with, this is the top of the radiator. I'm going to line the top of this fan up just with the core here. This well, the left hand side, the passenger side of the vehicle. I've got a measurement to come in from here, so it sits about there. And then you'll see at the bottom it's going to overhang over to the tank a fair bit. So what I'm going to do is I've set the fan on the bench, measured up how high it needs to sit up. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold up an aluminium box that's going to come all the way along the top, fold down, go in here, it'll cover the tank a bit all the way along, and then I'm going to have to do something in here to notch around the outlet and the drain. Now I was going to, well, I'm thinking this as it is, but it's got these mounting points obviously, but it's a pain in the ass. They're kind of, you can see that the hole is actually over top of the core here, and I would like the shroud to sneak down in this gap here so it encompasses the entire core. So what I might actually do is just with a grinder cut this excess off here and then re-drill and put a riv nut just in there, so it's in that empty spot. Same on that side, and then I can fold up my bit of aluminium straight up over and then straight back down with the lips here to meet, and then I'll shape it all, get it to fit nice and snug along here, tuck in the sides. And then what I'm going to do with this fan, seeing I've just simply chopped it out, it's round, it's got nothing to mount it off, I'm going to measure the diameter of this fan, cut the exact size hole into the aluminium shroud I make. This will fit up from the inside, and see it's got this lip here, so it'll sit up snug against that. And then maybe I might put a bunch of little screws all around it, or I might weld some tabs on and bolt it in or something, but I'll deal with that when I get there. And I'm just wondering if because this fan's going to sit, like I said, over to the side, I might actually even, it'll be I'm going to exaggerate it, but might even put a bit of a taper on this shroud just to angle this side in a bit. The rest of it here will probably be square. I'm just wondering whether I put some bead rolls in it, but we'll see. I'll start to mark out the aluminium and get an overall layout, and then I'll see how it looks.
First, a video. Yes, it is a scrambled egg. But as you look at it, I hope you'll begin to feel just slightly uneasy. Because you may notice that what's actually happening is that the egg is unscrambling itself. And you'll now see the yolk and the white have separated, and now they're going to be poured back into the egg. And we all know in our heart of hearts that this is not the way the universe works. A scrambled egg is mush, tasty mush, but it's mush. An egg is a beautiful, sophisticated thing that can create even more sophisticated things, such as chickens. And we know in our heart of hearts that the universe does not travel from mush to complexity. In fact, this gut instinct is reflected in one of the most fundamental laws of physics, the second law of thermodynamics, or the law of entropy. What that says basically is that the general tendency of the universe is to move from order and structure to lack of order, lack of structure, in fact, to mush. And that's why that video feels a bit strange. And yet, look around us. What we see around us is staggering complexity. Eric Beinhocker estimates that in New York City alone, there are some 10 billion SKUs, or distinct commodities, being traded. That's hundreds of times as many species as there are on Earth. And they're being traded by a species of almost 7 billion individuals who are linked by trade, travel, and the internet into a global system of stupendous complexity. So here's a great puzzle. In a universe ruled by the second law of thermodynamics, how is it possible to generate the sort of complexity I've described, the sort of complexity represented by you and me and the convention center? Well, the answer seems to be the universe can create complexity, but with great difficulty. In pockets, there appear what my colleague Fred Spear calls Goldilocks conditions. Not too hot, not too cold, just right for the creation of complexity. And slightly more complex things appear. And where you have slightly more complex things, you can get slightly more complex things. And in this way, complexity builds stage by stage. Each stage is magical because it creates the impression of something utterly new, appearing almost out of nowhere in the universe. We refer in big history to these moments as threshold moments. And at each threshold, the going gets tougher. The complex things get more fragile, more vulnerable. The Goldilocks conditions get more stringent, and it's more difficult to create complexity. Now, we, as extremely complex creatures, desperately need to know this story of how the universe creates complexity despite the second law, and why complexity means vulnerability and fragility. And that's the story that we tell in big history. But to do it, you have to do something that may at first sight seem completely impossible. You have to survey the whole history of the universe. So let's do it. Let's begin by winding the timeline back 13.7 billion years to the beginning of time.
So I've got that fan and shroud all ready to go on there. Now, as you've seen me do, I cut these sides down, moved my riv nuts over. These are now 6mm riv nuts, which they were 8mm, and like you saw, they came out stuck past the core. So I've changed those. Got the shroud all finished up here. Might struggle to get it on one-handed, but so as you just saw, I just fit the radiator in. I just used 4 screws here, just tapped through to hold the fan in. So when I cut the circle out, I cut it a really snug fit just for the outer of this fan, and there's actually a lip on the fan underneath there, so this pulls up tight into the circle. It's nice and snug. Weld on these tabs there you saw, hold it down. Yeah, the only thing you didn't see me do is you didn't see me fold it up. I actually went to my father's house and used his folder that he's got, which is a bit better, so that's why you didn't see me fold that up. But other than that, it's looking good, so I'm just going to bolt it down and then go pull that front pulley off to machine it.
Around us, there's nothing. There's not even time or space. Imagine the darkest, emptiest thing you can and cube it a gazillion times, and that's where we are. And then suddenly, bam! A universe appears, an entire universe, and we've crossed our first threshold. The universe is tiny, it's smaller than an atom, it's incredibly hot, it contains everything that's in today's universe, so you can imagine it's busting, and it's expanding at incredible speed. And at first it's just a blur, but very quickly distinct things begin to appear in that blur. Within the first second, energy itself shatters into distinct forces, including electromagnetism and gravity. And energy does something else quite magical. It congeals to form matter. Quarks that'll create protons, and leptons that include electrons. And all of that happens in the first second. Now we move forward 380,000 years. That's twice as long as humans have been on this planet. And now simple atoms appear of hydrogen and helium.
So here's a little job that I'm right in the middle of. Now, so I was rummaging through a bunch of parts when I was cleaning up some stuff, and I found that I had these mirrors stashed away that I completely forgot about. These were in the parts for my 626. I actually have no idea. I guess they came off the car at some point, but I don't know. They've got no markings or stampings on them, so I'm not sure of the brand or whatever. But originally I've been running these Victory mirrors, which are just like a I don't know, they come from Thailand or Malaysia or something. I like them personally, they look alright. A lot of people don't like them. I thought they suited the car, but when I brought these and fitted them, I did have to modify the bases a bit just to get them to sit properly. They obviously sit hard on the guard, and I had to reshape the bottom of these to get them to sit right on the Starlet. I think when I put them on, they might have been sitting up a bit and they look a bit funny. Anyway, I've now pulled these off and I'm going to try and fit these mirrors, which I think look a lot cooler, suit the car a bit better. Now, so I'm trying to work out how I'm going to mount these things. The mirrors I had on it, they have had this contraption here, screwed in the bottom. These, they're not M6, but whatever those bolts are. And it just simply had 2 holes, bolted to the top of the guard, a bit of a plate and nuts, and a bit of a surround that would go on. So simply 2 holes in the guards, and these just bolted down and pulled tight. So that was nice and simple. So the thing is, I now have obviously the holes in the guards to mount those mirrors. So I'd like to try and reuse them. Now these mirrors were complete, so you can see they had all the bits here to mount them. So they, I'll get the right mirror. So the way these are mounted, so they have this bracket that fits in. Oh, that was the right one. They have these bracket which fits in there. These screws here, oh, they just screwed in, screwed this whole base plate to the mirror, and then this part here which pivots essentially would go through. This would be on the underside of the guard, do them up tight, and so these would actually be able to pivot and be sprung, so if they got knocked they could move, which is a really good way of mounting them, to be honest. The problem is, for me, is that I only have one of these complete. The other one is broken and so won't work. And the other problem I'm coming into is these mirrors have these spaces. Is it that one? No, that one there. Which effectively change the position that the mirror's mounted on. So if I put that flush on the table, they sit about there with the base on them. They definitely sit up a lot more. So with these as they are sitting there, they don't sit right on the car. And obviously, like I said, that one's broken, so I can't use the other one's broken, so I can't use that. And also the way this sits up under the guard, it just wouldn't fit on the Starlet. So I've had to get a bit creative and try and make a way to bolt these mirrors onto the guard, and I want to do them in the same style of that these mirrors are. It means that they're solid mounted, which is not ideal, to be honest. They would be better if they had a bit of spring in them, but it's just what I'm going to do. With this style that these are supposed to be, you actually need a big hole in the, about that big, in the guard, which I mean I've got to chop the guard up further, and I don't really want to do that, to be honest. So what I've come up with a way of mounting these, because these plates here are quite intricate really. They're only a small piece, but there's a lot of different angles and different steps and all sorts going on, and it's not as simple as just making a plate and bolting it on, or so it's actually a little bit tricky. But so what I've decided to do, I've machined up these little spaces. So just that was a bit of round bar, bored a hole in the center, and then bored a hole down. And what that means is these mounting screws, which screw into there. I'm going to slip these into these spaces I've made all the way. These screw right down into there. I'm not going to do them up now, but you can get the gist. Those would screw in, you see. So once I've done them up tight, I'm going to put those in, do them up tight, and then I'm going to, if I can show you in the camera angle, I will essentially cut them flush along with the mirror. If that's going to make any sense. Chop them straight off and grind them flush with the mirror. So I'll do that. And then I've made up these plates just out of some sheet steel. That might not be the right one, but so they sit flush on there. So once I've got these spaces on and cut, I'll then put these on top, mark where they come, where they touch, the two circles. I'll then cut a hole in the center of these, so that once those are bolted on, screwed on, I'll place this, and then I'll tack this plate to these, tack them on, and then I can pull them off, weld them complete. And then I'll simply, not with these, but essentially take a bolt, and I'll weld two bolts up as stands, sort of similar to that, in the right spacing to suit what the holes on the guards already are. And that should give me, that'll give me a nice fixture plate that's pulled tight into the mirror, and then two bolts off. That'll give it a nice surface to pull down on. Once I've done that, I'll be taking these, which are the, I don't know what you call them, mounting plates, spacers, whatever, and I will reshape the bottom of these, take that wedge out of them, until when I sit these on the guards, they sit flat in the right orientation. It's got this, I guess it's the, I don't know, the body line of the mirror. You can see this flat line. Essentially that needs to be horizontal on the car, and it would look good. So I'm going to start doing that now. I'm going to put these on, sort out getting them flat, grind them flat, get the holes in these plates, tack them up, and then I will go sit them on the car, see how they're looking, and get on to modifying these. So it's a little bit time consuming, but I'm pretty keen to put the effort in and get these mirrors on. I think they'll look a lot cooler than these old, well not old because they're new, but these Victory mirrors. Quite a bit different, but still in the vein of what I want. I could have maybe hunted down some factory Starlet guard mirrors, but on the shape of Starlet that mine is, the drop hatch or the slat front, whatever you want to call them, I'm not particularly a fan of the Starlet mirrors. They look great on the earlier shapes, but I think these mirrors will suit it quite well. So let's have a go.
Now, I want to pause for a moment, 380,000 years after the origins of the universe, because we actually know quite a lot about the universe at this stage. We know, above all, that it was extremely simple. It consisted of huge clouds of hydrogen and helium atoms, and they have no structure. They're really a sort of cosmic mush. But that's not completely true. Recent studies by satellites such as the WMAP satellite have shown that, in fact, there are just tiny differences in that background. What you see here, the blue areas are about 1/1000 of a degree cooler than the red areas. These are tiny differences, but it was enough for the universe to move on to the next stage of building complexity, and this is how it works. Gravity is more powerful where there's more stuff. So where you get slightly denser areas, gravity starts compacting clouds of hydrogen and helium atoms. So we can imagine the early universe breaking up into 1 billion clouds. And each cloud is compacted, gravity gets more powerful as density increases, the temperature begins to rise at the center of each cloud, and then at the center of each cloud, the temperature crosses the threshold temperature of 10 million degrees. Protons start to fuse, there's a huge release of energy, and bam! We have our first stars. From about 200 million years after the Big Bang, stars begin to appear all through the universe, billions of them. And the universe is now significantly more interesting and more complex. Stars will create the Goldilocks conditions for crossing two new thresholds.
So I've just given the Starlet a wash and dried it off and put it back inside the shed now. So I'm just going to walk in the car and show you all the runs that I need to cut out. So the first step's going to be with a brand new razor blade or a few of them, go around and just cut the excess paint, just physically cut the excess paint off where I've, from when I painted it a few years ago, where all the big runs are. So you can see you've got a big run there in the front guard. This passenger door right on the seam here, you might see there's a big sag all the way along there. I think that back quarter's pretty good. The back hatch, I've got another big sag, same deal, right along that there you can see, massive. I think this quarter is pretty good. There might be one sag in it somewhere. Oh yeah, there we are, right there. Roof's pretty reasonable. I think the door's pretty good. Front guard was pretty good. And the bonnet's terrible. This light, you can just see how haggard the bonnet still is really with this light. It was a pretty beaten up bonnet as it was. But there's a good run right through the middle of it and it's pretty rough. So I think I've decided I'll attack the bonnet first. At least that'll give me a good chance to just hone the process that I need to do, and at least if I balls it up, it's just the bonnet and I can repaint the bonnet. Now, when I built my van that you might have seen in some other videos, I painted that and didn't get the greatest finish as after, and so I went to wet sand and buff that, and I actually ended up rubbing through the paint in a few spots. So when I painted this car, I was adamant that I needed to put a bit more paint on than I had, just to make sure when I wet sanded it, it wouldn't rub through, which then kind of ended up in some of the runs you see. But overall it's pretty good, but I just like to try and, well, seeing I've put all the effort in to get it to this point, I really like to see if I can get it a bit straighter and just a bit more polished. The overall the panel work is good compared to how the car was. If you've seen and remember back to what the car was like, it was toast. So it's definitely not perfect. It's definitely not straight. There's actually quite a, I don't know. In some lights you see every imperfection on the car, and other lights it looks great. But I just like to try and sort of make it as good as I can. So yeah, like I said, first step I'm gonna attack that bonnet. I think that'll be the best thing for me to do. And just if I do that and it ends up being a bit of a balls up, then I will just call it quits and leave the body as it is. But if I can at the very least get rid of those big runs and sags, it'd be mint.
When very large stars die, they create temperatures so high that protons begin to fuse in all sorts of exotic combinations to form all the elements of the periodic table. If, like me, you're wearing a gold ring, it was forged in a supernova explosion. So now the universe is chemically more complex. And in a chemically more complex universe, it's possible to make more things. And what starts happening is that around young suns, young stars, all these elements combine, they swirl around, the energy of the star stirs them around, they form particles, they form snowflakes, they form little dust motes, they form rocks, they form asteroids, and eventually they form planets and moons. And that is how our solar system was formed 4.5 billion years ago. Rocky planets like our Earth are significantly more complex than stars because they contain a much greater diversity of materials. So we've crossed a fourth threshold of complexity.
So I've had my one last going over of the 1500 grit by hand, just removing any further orange peel, so that's looking all good now. And I've just dug out the bits for the next step, so I've got my air operated DA sander here. Going to be sticking this sort of 10mm foam interface pad onto that, and then that's standard sanding disc this would take, and these 2000 grit pads we'll stick to the interface pad and then on. So the idea here is just to go over this whole bonnet evenly with the sander, being super careful not to sand on the edges where you can easily burn through the paint, or on the ridges here. So just going to go over it all with a light mist of water and the DA sander and see how it turns out.
Now, the going gets tougher. The next stage introduces entities that are significantly more fragile, significantly more vulnerable, but they're also much more creative and much more capable of generating further complexity. I'm talking, of course, about living organisms. Living organisms are created by chemistry. We are huge packages of chemicals. So chemistry is dominated by the electromagnetic force. That operates over smaller scales than gravity, which explains why you and I are smaller than stars or planets. Now, what are the ideal conditions for chemistry? What are the Goldilocks conditions? Well, first, you need energy, but not too much. In the center of a star, there's so much energy that any atoms that combine will just get busted apart again, but not too little. In intergalactic space, there's so little energy that atoms can't combine. What you want is just the right amount, and planets, it turns out, are just right because they're close to stars, but not too close. You also need a great diversity of chemical elements, and you need liquids, such as water. Why? Well, in gases, atoms move past each other so fast that they can't hitch up. In solids, atoms are stuck together. They can't move. In liquids, they can cruise and cuddle and link up to form molecules. Now, where do you find such Goldilocks conditions? Well, planets are great, and our early Earth was almost perfect.
So I've just finished going around the whole car and cutting out the rest of the runs. So there was a good one on the top of the guard there. There was one real good one along the entire lower part of the door there. Let's got rid of that. There's a small one down there by the guard. This big one along here, which I've pretty much finished scraping off. Just a couple down there. So just gone over the whole car, done what I can, and then now I'm going to start wet sanding.
It was just the right distance from its star to contain huge oceans of liquid water. And deep beneath those oceans, at cracks in the Earth's crust, you've got heat seeping up from inside the Earth, and you've got a great diversity of elements. So at those deep oceanic vents, fantastic chemistry began to happen, and atoms combined in all sorts of exotic combinations. But of course, life is more than just exotic chemistry. How do you stabilize those huge molecules that seem to be viable? Well, it's here that life introduces an entirely new trick. You don't stabilize the individual, you stabilize the template, the thing that carries information, and you allow the template to copy itself. And DNA, of course, is the beautiful molecule that contains that information. You'll be familiar with the double helix of DNA. Each rung contains information. So DNA contains information about how to make living organisms. And DNA also copies itself. So it copies itself and scatters the templates through the ocean. So the information spreads. Notice that information has become part of our story. The real beauty of DNA, though, is in its imperfections. As it copies itself, once in every billion rungs, there tends to be an error. And what that means is that DNA is, in effect, learning. It's accumulating new ways of making living organisms because some of those errors work. So DNA is learning, and it's building greater diversity and greater complexity. And we can see this happening over the last 4 billion years. For most of that time of life on Earth, living organisms have been relatively simple, single cells, but they had great diversity and inside great complexity. Then from about 600 to 800 million years ago, multi-celled organisms appear. You get fungi, you get fish, you get plants, you get amphibia, you get reptiles, and then, of course, you get the dinosaurs. And occasionally, there are disasters. 65 million years ago, an asteroid landed on Earth near the Yucatan Peninsula, creating conditions equivalent to those of a nuclear war. And the dinosaurs are wiped out. Terrible news for the dinosaurs, but great news for our mammalian ancestors who flourished in the niches left empty by the dinosaurs. And we human beings are part of that creative evolutionary pulse that began 65 million years ago with the landing of an asteroid. Humans appeared about 200,000 years ago, and I believe we count as a threshold in this great story. Let me explain why. We've seen that DNA learns, in a sense. It accumulates information, but it is so slow. DNA accumulates information through random errors some of which just happen to work. But DNA had actually generated a faster way of learning. It had produced organisms with brains, and those organisms can learn in real time. They accumulate information, they learn. The sad thing is, when they die, the information dies with them. Now, what makes humans different is human language. We are blessed with a language, a system of communication so powerful and so precise that we can share what we've learned with such precision that it can accumulate in the collective memory. And that means it can outlast the individuals who learnt that information, and it can accumulate from generation to generation. And that's why, as a species, we're so creative and so powerful, and that's why we have a history. We seem to be the only species in 4 billion years to have this gift. I call this ability collective learning. It's what makes us different. We can see it at work in the earliest stages of human history. We evolved as a species in the savanna lands of Africa. But then you see humans migrating into new environments, into desert lands, into jungles, into the ice age tundra of Siberia, tough environment, into the Americas, into Australasia. Each migration involved learning new ways of exploiting the environment, new ways of dealing with their surroundings. Then 10,000 years ago, exploiting a sudden change in global climates with the end of the last ice age, humans learnt to farm. Farming was an energy bonanza. And exploiting that energy, human populations multiplied, human societies got larger, denser, more interconnected. And then, from about 500 years ago, humans began to link up globally through shipping, through trains, through telegraph, through the internet, until now we seem to form a single global brain of almost 7 billion individuals, and that brain is learning at warp speed. And in the last 200 years, something else has happened. We've stumbled on another energy bonanza in fossil fuels. So fossil fuels and collective learning together explain the staggering complexity we see around us. So, here we are, back at the convention center. We've been on a return journey of 13.7 billion years. I hope you agree this is a powerful story, and it's a story in which humans play an astonishing and creative role. But it also contains warnings. Collective learning is a very, very powerful force, and it's not clear that we humans are in charge of it. I remember very vividly as a child growing up in England, living through the Cuban Missile Crisis. For a few days, the entire biosphere seemed to be on the verge of destruction. And the same weapons are still here, and they're still armed. If we avoid that trap, others are waiting for us. We're burning fossil fuels at such a rate that we seem to be undermining the Goldilocks conditions that made it possible for human civilizations to flourish over the last 10,000 years. So what big history can do is show us the nature of our complexity and fragility and the dangers that face us. But it can also show us our power with collective learning. And now, finally, this is what I want. I want my grandson, Daniel, and his friends and his generation throughout the world to know the story of big history and to know it so well that they understand both the challenges that face us and the opportunities that face us. And that's why a group of us are building a free online syllabus in big history for high school students throughout the world. We believe that big history will be a vital intellectual tool for them as Daniel and his generation face the huge challenges and also the huge opportunities ahead of them at this threshold moment in the history of our beautiful planet. I thank you for your attention.
I woke up this morning, yawning. News lady told me the sky is falling. Warning, watch the ice you walk away all sinking. Sitting on the brink of extinction, then I'm thinking, waiting, watching the stars on my last day.